Right now, as you are watching this, forecasters at the National Weather Service office in Guam are tracking a new disturbance sitting near Yap, designated Invest 90W. Less than a week after the last super typhoon to hit this same stretch of ocean finally dissipated over the Yellow Sea. Tropical Storm Risk, one of the most closely watched independent forecasting groups in the world, raised its outlook for this season just 9 days ago, on the 7th of July, to what it now calls an exceptionally active season, running roughly 40% above the long-term average. China's own National Climate Center is forecasting up to 6 typhoons to form in the northwest Pacific and South China Sea this month alone, well above the average of 3.8, with up to 3 of them expected to make landfall, nearly double the historical norm of 1.8. And the single number driving almost all of it, a developing El Niño event that the World Meteorological Organization says could rank among the strongest ever recorded, has not even peaked yet. The typhoon that just tore through the Marianas, the Philippines, and T-people, and left 18 more missing, and by every measure available to the scientists tracking this season, it may not have been the worst storm we see before this year is over. This is the story of why meteorologists are saying the most dangerous stretch of the 2026 typhoon season has not even started yet, sourced directly from the same forecasting centers issuing these warnings in real time, not recycled headlines. Drop a comment and tell me if you live anywhere in the path this season has already carved through: Guam, the Marianas, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, or the Chinese coast, because the agencies covered in this video are the same ones that will be tracking whatever comes next. If you want grounded storm coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free, and a like helps this reach the people who actually need to see this before the next one forms. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand why scientists are so confident the worst is still ahead, it helps to understand exactly where we are sitting inside the calendar of a typical Western Pacific typhoon season, because the timing here is not a minor detail, it is the entire point. The Northwest Pacific Basin has no official start or end date the way the Atlantic hurricane season does. Storms are technically possible in any month of the year, but the activity is heavily concentrated in a window, running from roughly July through October, and within that window, the single busiest stretch is August and September specifically. On average, the basin produces something close to 5.7 typhoons in August and 5 in September, compared with an average of only 3.7 in July and 3.4 in October. In other words, the storm that just devastated 3 countries and a U.S. territory formed and struck during what is, in a typical year, one of the quieter months of the entire season. The truly dangerous months, the ones where the basin's own long-term averages predict the most frequent and most intense storms, have not arrived yet. This year is not shaping up to be a typical year, and the season's own pace so far is the clearest evidence of that. By the 24th of May, 6 typhoons had already formed in the Western Pacific, roughly 3 more than the normal pace for that point in the calendar. The storm that just struck the Marianas in China was the 9th named tropical storm of the season, the 3rd typhoon, and the 2nd storm to reach the unofficial super typhoon threshold, all of that arriving before the season had even entered what forecasters consider its serious phase. Weather News, a private forecasting firm that tracks the basin closely, is now projecting somewhere between 27 and 29 total tropical storms and typhoons for the full year, which would place 2026 among the busiest seasons on record. The Philippine National Weather Agency, PAGASA, has forecast between 6 and 9 additional tropical cyclones, forming inside or entering its own area of responsibility between July and September alone, with a further 5 to 8 expected in the final 3 months of the year. None of these are speculative guesses pulled from nowhere. They are formal seasonal outlooks issued by the government meteorological agencies of the exact countries sitting in this season's path, and every one of them is pointing in the same direction, busier than normal and not finished. The reason nearly every one of these forecasts keeps returning to the same explanation is that they are all responding to the same underlying driver, a developing El Niño event. El Niño describes a periodic warming of sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern Pacific Ocean, and it does 2 specific things that matter enormously for typhoon behavior. First, it raises the pool of warm water available to fuel storm intensification across a wider stretch of ocean than usual. Second, and just as importantly, it physically shifts the typical tracks that typhoons follow, bending them further west toward the coasts of the Philippines, Taiwan, and mainland China, rather than curving harmlessly out to sea the way many storms do in a typical year. Hui Su, Chair Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, put it plainly while assessing this season's early storms. El Nino is shifting typhoon tracks westward toward China's coast and heightening risk, while climate change is separately making the storms that do form wetter and more destructive once they arrive. The World Meteorological Organization raised its own forecast for this El Nino event just weeks ago, flagging the possibility that it could grow into one of the strongest such events ever measured, with some forecasting models suggesting a peak later this year that could rival the historic event of 1997 and 98, one of the most extreme El Nino episodes ever recorded. An event that has not yet reached its peak, sitting underneath a season that is already running weeks ahead of its normal pace, is precisely the combination that has forecasters at multiple independent agencies using words like exceptional and above normal rather than routine. Japan's own national forecasting community is watching the same signal with specific concern for its own coastline. The Japan Weather Association's seasonal outlook flags an increased risk of typhoons actually approaching Japan in August specifically, driven by a separate but related shift. The La Niña-like weather pattern that lingered through 2025 is now weakening, which makes it less likely that the Pacific High, the dome of high pressure that normally helps deflect typhoons, away from the strength through the back half of summer. A weaker Pacific High means less of a wall, standing between the open ocean and Japan's own coastline, exactly during the months when the basin typically produces its most storms. The agency's own historical data shows Japan's typhoon season peaking in September, specifically in terms of which storms are most likely to actually take a track passing near the country, even though August tends to produce the highest raw count of storms forming across the basin as a whole. Forecasters at the Japan Weather Association describe this as a season where the number of storms approaching the country matters less on its own than the combination of their intensity, their track, and their forward speed. Three separate variables that all still remain genuinely uncertain this far out from the peak months themselves. There is a genuinely important lesson sitting inside how forecasters are currently handling the uncertainty of what comes next, and it is worth understanding rather than skipping past, because it explains why you are seeing so many watch alerts without a matching wave of panic from the meteorologists actually issuing them. Earlier this month, a separate disturbance near Yap, tracked as Invest 97W, was projected by some long-range computer models to develop into a full typhoon passing directly through the Mariana Islands. It never did. A related system, Invest 98W, followed the same pattern, watched closely, discussed publicly, and ultimately amounting to nothing more than a wet, breezy few days. Landon Aidlet, a warning coordination meteorologist with the National Weather Service office in Guam, addressed that exact pattern directly while discussing the newest disturbance now being tracked near Yap, cautioning residents not to place all of their stress on a single forecast model glimpsed on a phone screen, since any individual model is only one of several possible outcomes rather than a guarantee. His advice for a region still recovering from the storm that just struck was to maintain general awareness, focus on ongoing repairs, and be ready to shift into active preparation mode the moment the actual picture changes, rather than treating every early watch as a confirmed coming disaster. That is not forecasters downplaying the season's real risk. It is forecasters being honest about the difference between a credible seasonal outlook built from decades of data about El Nino years and confirmed by multiple independent agencies, and a single storm track on a single app that has not yet been confirmed by an actual tropical cyclone formation alert. The scientific reason a warmer, more active season like this one is capable of producing storms stronger than what has already struck comes down to a concept meteorologists call maximum potential intensity, a theory developed back in 1987 by MIT hurricane scientist Kerry Emanuel. Maximum potential intensity describes the theoretical ceiling on how powerful any individual tropical cyclone can become based entirely on the ocean and atmospheric conditions it happens to be moving through in that specific moment. Emanuel's central finding, one that has held up across decades of follow-up research since, is that a warming ocean raises that ceiling, meaning the absolute strongest a storm is physically capable of becoming keeps climbing as the water beneath it holds more heat. That does not guarantee every storm will reach its theoretical maximum, since factors like wind shear and dry air intrusion still regularly prevent storms from fully using the fuel available to them. But it does mean that in a season already running unusually warm across the exact stretch of ocean where these storms form, the physical ceiling on how strong the next one is capable of becoming sits measurably higher than it would in an average year. Meteorologist and former Noe hurricane hunter Jeff Masters has separately noted that the basin has now produced as many Category 4 and Category 5 equivalent typhoon landfalls against inhabited land in roughly the past decade as it did across the entire 5.5 decades before. That combined, a statistic he describes as evidence that the ceiling itself has been quietly rising for years, not just this one unusually active season. There's a comparison worth pulling directly out of the storm that just passed, because it doubles as the clearest possible preview of what preparation, or the lack of it, will actually mean if a stronger storm does form in the weeks ahead. When the last typhoon reached the Chinese mainland, authorities there moved approximately 2.8 million people out of its path in the days before landfall, drawing on an emergency response system built and refined specifically because this exact stretch of coastline gets tested by storms like this almost every single year. The result was 0 confirmed deaths on the Chinese mainland from a storm that had been a Category 5 monster just days earlier. In the Philippines, where an earthquake weeks earlier had already destabilized hillside soil across the same region, the storm's rain bands later soaked, the outcome was 23 confirmed deaths and 18 more people still missing, almost entirely from landslides that struck communities with far less lead time and far less evacuation infrastructure in place. Nearly 11,000 people in the Philippines were still displaced from their own homes in the days after that storm passed, a number that had barely begun to shrink by the time forecasters started flagging the next wave of disturbances now under watch. The same season, producing the same category of storm, is now openly forecast by multiple government agencies to produce more systems before it ends, which means every region sitting anywhere near this basin is currently being handed the exact same choice those two countries already made without knowing it. Build the warning systems and evacuation plans now, while the forecast is still just a forecast, or find out the hard way which category your own region falls into the next time a storm actually forms. History offers a fairly direct preview of what a season shaped this heavily by El Niño tends to produce once it actually reaches its peak months. The 1997-98 El Niño, the event several forecasting models now say this year's could rival or even exceed, coincided with one of the most damaging typhoon stretches the Western Pacific Basin had seen in decades, a period researchers still reference as a baseline for how strongly this specific climate pattern can reshape storm tracks and intensity across an entire season rather than just a single storm. The mechanism has not changed in the nearly 3 decades since. What has changed, according to the same body of research behind maximum potential intensity theory, is the baseline temperature of the ocean these storms now form over, which is measurably warmer today than it was during that 1997 and 98 season, giving any comparably strong El Niño event even more raw fuel to work with this time around. That is precisely why forecasters are not simply repeating an old headline when they warn that this season could be exceptional. They are pointing to a historical analog, adjusting it for a warmer ocean than existed the last time a comparable El Niño event occurred, and arriving at a forecast that sits above even that historical benchmark. So what does all of this actually mean for you, wherever you happen to be watching this from? If you live anywhere across the Western Pacific Typhoon Basin, the practical takeaway from everything scientists are currently saying is not that a specific catastrophic storm is guaranteed to strike your exact location. It is that the months statistically most likely to produce the season's strongest storms, August and September specifically, are still ahead, sitting underneath an El Niño event that has not yet reached its own peak, inside a season that has already run weeks ahead of its normal pace since May. That combination is precisely why the meteorologists actually issuing these forecasts are treating this as a season to watch closely rather than one that ended when the last storm's remnants finally faded over the Yellow Sea. Keeping half an eye on official advisories from agencies like the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, PAGASA, or the Japan Meteorological Agency over the coming weeks, rather than waiting for a storm to already be a confirmed threat before paying attention, is the single most actionable habit sitting inside everything we just walked through. The honest, grounded summary is this. The 2026 Western Pacific typhoon season has already produced a super typhoon powerful enough to be described as the most powerful tropical cyclone ever to strike United States territory, and it did so during a month the basin's own long-term averages consider comparatively quiet. A developing El Niño event that multiple forecasting agencies say could rank among the strongest ever recorded has not yet reached its peak. China's National Climate Center, the Japan Weather Association, PAGASA, and the independent forecasting group Tropical Storm Risk have all independently raised their outlooks for the months directly ahead, pointing to the same underlying drivers. Warmer than usual ocean water, a weakening barrier that once helped deflect storms away from Japan, and typhoon tracks being pulled further west toward populated coastlines than in an average year. The storm that just passed killed at least 23 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more, and by the honest assessment of the scientists actually tracking this season, the ceiling on how strong the next storm could become is higher this year than in a typical one. August and September, historically the 2 most active months in this entire basin, have not even started yet. We are going to keep tracking this as the rest of the season develops, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, the national weather agencies actually responsible for the coastlines in this storm's path, and the meteorologists actually explaining the mechanism rather than just posting a number on a screen. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one forming. Because based on everything scientists are currently saying, the season's busiest stretch is still ahead of us, not behind us. And leave that comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and whether you have a real evacuation plan in place if the next watch alert turns into something more serious, because that answer matters more than most people realize until the moment they actually need it. Because behind every one of these forecasts is a family in the Marianas who just finished repairing what the last storm damaged. A meteorologist in Guam trying to keep an entire region calm without downplaying a real risk. A household in the Philippines still waiting to move back into a home the last landslide made unsafe. And 2.8 million people in China whose evacuation worked simply because the plan already existed before anyone needed it. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.